Before we get into today's stories, visit dreadsarmy.com to sign up for the Dread Weekly newsletter so you don't miss out on any updates. Also, check out all of the channels in the Dread Network on dreadsarmy.com or in the description below. Thanks for listening. Now let's get to the stories. I've been stationed at Badlands National Park for several years now. It's a good job most days. The incident I'm writing about took place last summer in mid-July, during one of those hot, near-desert-like days when the thermometer was pushing over 100. Badlands is quite an interesting place. It's a kind of wild, stark beauty carved out of the land. But then it's also this quasi-moon surface in some areas, full of rugged rock formations, sharp cliffs, and jagged spires. Working as a park ranger is an enriching experience. You get to see a different side of the world. It's quiet, it's serene, it's beautiful. There's something about the isolation that puts things into perspective and helps remind you why you signed up for this duty. But it's not always exciting. There's a lot of paperwork, liaising with tourists, and maintenance work to keep the trails and viewing areas in decent condition. And every so often, we get some fool who thinks it's funny to chuck a soda can off into the wilderness or start carving their name into our trees and rock. But you've got to love the job because there's no replacement for those breathtaking sunsets or the sight of wildlife in their element. I was on my usual rounds that day, checking the trails, making sure the trail signage was intact, observing if the animals were behaving normally, and unfortunately, also picking up the occasional litter left behind. I was on the Sage Creek Loop, a good third of the way through, on the rise that gives you that really fabulous view across to the rock formations on the other side of the creek. It was approaching evening, and the critters were starting to hunker down for the night. And then I heard something. It was a strange sound, out of the ordinary. The best I can describe it was a low, guttural grunt, accompanied by a sort of knocking noise. The direction of the noise was more or less clear. It seemed to be coming from off to the west, down past the base of the hill. But what it was, well, that I couldn't pinpoint. But being out in the field, you learn not to jump at every sound. Things in nature can be unpredictable, and there's often a logical explanation for anything odd. So I decided to continue picking up some trash. Strange sounds or not, I still had work to do. Then I heard it again, but louder this time and more insistent. It was a deep, resonant growl, contrasting eerily against the peaceful silence of the park. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. At this point, I decided to shelve my cleanup task and investigate further. As I made my way down that slope, every sense of mine was on high alert, watching for any sign of movement or another sound to point me in the direction. But the world around me had gone strangely silent. Suddenly, I noticed a pattern in the silence. The animals were anxious, nervous even. They knew something was off. I saw unusual tracks on the ground. There appeared to be large footprints embedded deep into the earth, almost human but bigger, much bigger, and barefoot. I followed the tracks deeper into the wilderness. It was then I saw it. My heart froze as I took in the colossal figure standing tall and ominous, just a few feet away from me. It was massive, standing easily at about 9 feet, and adorned with dark brown, almost reddish hair that covered the majority of its powerful body. The creature had a pronounced forehead, wide nostrils, and a face that was a mixture of man and ape. Its features resembled those of a primate, but there was a human-like intelligence behind its eyes. They were deep-set and dark brown, almost impossible to see in the fading light. There was something about its face, scarred and weather-beaten, that told of its years in the wilderness. Before I could react, it produced this deafening roar, sending birds flying away from nearby trees. The sheer power of that sound was stunning, echoing throughout the deserted wilderness. The smell of the beast was equally shocking. It was a musty, pungent, putrid odor that seemed to clog my nostrils. With my heart pounding hard in my chest, I backtracked slowly, my eyes never straying from the ape-like creature. The silence of the forest was broken yet again by the creature's deep growl. It watched me as I slowly retreated, its deep-set eyes never leaving me until I was out of its sight. When I reached the trail again, alone but safe, I began to question my sanity. Was it possible? Had I indeed come face to face with the fabled Sasquatch? I reported the incident to my colleagues, but it was dismissed as a result of working alone in the wild in harsh conditions. They said my mind was just playing tricks on me in the changing light of dusk. However, the encounter had a deep impact on my life. Each rustle in the brush still arouses fear. Every unknown noise in the wild feels like a signal of impending danger. I'm no longer the same ranger who found solace in the isolation and serenity of the wilderness. Now, there's a lingering sense of fear, a tinge of uneasiness as I patrol the same trails. And I can't help but feel that sometimes those deep-set eyes are still watching me from the shadows. Whatever creature I encountered that evening, it was a stark reminder of the unexplored and untamed wilderness that lies beyond our understanding. It was early spring in Two.Chugach State Park when it happened, one of my favorite times of the year. Now, if you aren't familiar with Two.Chugach, well, it's an Alaskan chunk of wilderness all its own. Mountains break the skyline, endless forests run thick and dense, hiding all kinds of wildlife within. Not to mention the pristine lakes that mirror the vast expanse of the Alaskan sky. It's harsh but undeniably beautiful. One of my favorite places in the world to be. I remember that day well. I've been a park ranger here for about a decade, but nothing in all those silent, solitary patrols ever prepared me for it. See, being a park ranger at Chugach isn't just a job. This park lived in my blood. It was the reason I woke up in the morning. Every day, it was my responsibility to ensure the safety of its visitors, and an honor to preserve the pristine nature of the park. My routine activities included patrolling the trails, trying to reduce wildlife encounters with park visitors, and responding to occasional visitor queries. That day, everything was business as usual. However, as the sun started setting, I noticed something odd. It had been a calm evening. The forest was silent except for the distant rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional call of a bird. I was headed back toward the station after having completed my last patrol of the day. I drove along the dirt road, my truck's headlights cutting through the twilight, when I noticed a figure at the edge of the light darting quickly across the path. It moved too quickly for me to get a good look, but it was unusually large. Bigger than a bear but not lumbering like one. It seemed to glide silently across the ground. I continued driving along the trail, my heart pounding, adrenaline spiking as my mind raced. Hours later, back at the station, I was still puzzled over what I had seen. I'm used to the wildlife around here. I've encountered bears, moose, lynx, and even wolves. But whatever this was, it was different. It moved with a swiftness and agility I've never seen before, like it barely disturbed the earth beneath its feet. The logical part of me reasoned that it must have been a known animal, maybe a moose running off. Yet, there was a nagging feeling in me that it wasn't something so mundane. Earlier in the day, I'd received a radio call from a group of anxious hikers, claiming to smell something decaying near a popular trail. This was always a concern in bear country. If there was a carcass nearby, we had to close the trails immediately for the safety of the park visitors. But that wasn't all. They said they could hear eerie laughter carried on the wind, like someone or something was watching them. At the time, I had dismissed it as nerves from city folks not used to the strange noises in the wild. There were no signs of a carcass when I went to investigate, so I moved on. Now, thinking back, I wondered if it could be connected. It wasn't until dusk had completely fallen, and the last specks of light had vanished when I heard it. An animal's howl, eerie, echoing through the cold mountain air. Nothing unusual, except there was a human-like quality to it. A bone-chilling mockery, like laughter almost, accompanied the howl. Then, the lights at the station began to flicker. The scent of decay and earthiness wafted through the open window, stronger now. I shut the window and locked it quickly, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. I decided it was time to call it a night, slid the bolt across the door, and prepared for bed. But sleep was a long time coming, and I was left alone with the strange, unsettling events of the day. The remainder of the night seemed to last an eternity. Each creak of the building and distant call of wildlife sent my heart racing. It wasn't until the early rays of dawn hit my cabin that I finally managed to drift off to a restless sleep. The following day, I woke with the sunrise and carried on with my duties, but with a heightened sense of alertness. Every odd track, unusual noise, or unexplained scent made me suspect its origin. I was determined to understand what I was dealing with. I needed to ensure the safety of our park goers, and selfishly, myself. I didn't want to be out there with some unidentifiable predator, if there was one. Despite my earlier fears, the majority of the day passed uneventfully. That was until late afternoon, when I received a distress call from a family of campers, alleging that they saw an animal with glowing red eyes that was far larger than any known local creature. Heart pounding and a shiver running down my spine, I made my way to the family's campsite. They were visibly shaken and quickly packed up to leave, leaving me to investigate their claims. Where the family had noticed the figure, there was a distinct musky stench, mingling with the scent of decomposition. The smell was overwhelming, and I had to fight back the urge to gag, knowing there was no natural source I could attribute it to around that area. Eventually, dusk fell onto the Alaskan wilderness. I made my way back towards the station, hoping to leave behind the unsettling events of the day. However, my hopes were in vain. About halfway back, a feeling of dread washed over me. The hairs at the back of my neck stood up as bone-chilling whispers seemed to arise from nowhere. I held my breath, waiting, and then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees was a figure shifting and coiling upon itself. It was large, and with an eerie agility, the figure took on the shape of a coyote, but one much too large for reality. Its fur was a shadow. Its eyes were red and glowing in the low light. Before I could reach for my radio, it disappeared, leaving me staring at the empty forest trail. That night, I couldn't deny the truth anymore. I was dealing with a creature of Alaskan native lore. It was a shapeshifter, a skinwalker. In the days that followed, I found it hard to carry out my duties. Now, I didn't only need to worry about the park's conservation, but also about an unknowable entity that seemed to lurk in its heart. I grappled with ideas of alerting authorities or park visitors, but how could I expect to be believed? And if I were, what actions could be taken? After a week of restless nights, unusual sights, and eerie sounds, everything stopped. As if the creature, the skinwalker, had vanished. Things got back to normal, or rather as normal as they could get. Maybe it was just passing through. That's the only explanation that gave me any solace. It's been years since those bizarre days in Two.Chugach State Park. I continue to serve here. My respect for the power and mystery of this land has only deepened. I'm not a man of superstitions, but I can't deny or rationalize what I experienced during that springtime in Alaska. Some things we just can't explain, and maybe we aren't meant to. I've been a ranger at the Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve for the last 18 years. I've seen a lot. I've seen hail in the middle of summer, rattlesnakes slithering about in frigid temperatures, tourists thinking they can climb the dunes in flip-flops. But this was something else. It wasn't something I signed up for. My job is to keep the park safe and preserved for this generation and the ones yet to come. I get to traipse about in the largest sandbox in North America, making sure people and wildlife coexist in harmony, and the ecosystem thrives as Mother Nature intended. On the day in question, it was pretty much business as usual. I had started my rounds early, braving the biting chill of the Colorado morning, and did my best in maintaining the delicate balance of this ecosystem. As the day wore on, the temperature soared. The dunes, unrelenting in their scorching beauty, shimmered under the high noon sun. I kept my eyes peeled for tourists venturing too deep into the park without adequate supplies, or the sporadic trail of litter that wore my nerves more than I care to admit. Just past noon, I found myself on crest duty, checking the conditions of the ridgelines. These dunes can be treacherous, and sudden shifts in weather could lead to potential hazards. My binoculars scoped the landscape, inspecting the telltale patterns of the sand, indicating stability or a recently occurred slip. I just lowered my binocs, about to move to the next point, when I saw it. Now, I didn't get a clear view. Mind you, the midday sun and glinting sand wouldn't let you see a cactus till you damn near sat on it. Still, there was definitely something unusual in my field of vision. I quickly turned my head, but whatever it was had gone. The sand was untouched, save for patterns etched by the wind. I stood there staring at the serene, deadly beauty of the dunes, with a chill of unfathomable dread snaking down my spine. Who knows, I thought, heat stroke could make a man see things. Maybe I had better get myself some water and sit down for a moment. I moved on, ignoring the prickling sensation of being watched. I couldn't shake that thought that something was out there. Maybe it was nothing more than a trick of the light, a mirage, or so I hoped. Despite the silent assurance of the vast, sun-bleached landscape in front of me, unease hung over me like a vulture circling its dying prey. I continued with my duties, patrolling the immense sandbox we call the Great Sand Dunes National Park. But as the sun plunged towards the horizon, my mind kept drifting back to the unknown creature I saw in the dunes. The dunes were eerily still through my binocs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Back at the visitor center, as my colleague Earl was leaving his shift, I mentioned the unsettlement troubling me for the last few hours. Earl's been around for nearly as long as I have. He just smiled, acting like the old man that he is, and told me, "John, you've been looking at the sand too long." Before heading home for the day, a feeling urged me to give the dunes one final check. I drove my truck to a more remote part of the park. I was out near a bowl-like depression where the sands formed steep, undulating contours. As I peered through my binoculars, a movement caught my eye. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was an enormous figure. I estimated around 8 feet tall, standing upright on two legs. It had dark, rugged scales seeming to blend with the shadows. Its head looked disturbingly reptilian, complete with a pair of piercing yellow eyes that echoed an age-old savagery. My blood went ice cold. Its gaze was focused, searching, predatory even. Despite its distance from me, I could sense its intelligence. I didn't know what to think of this creature. It was both reptilian and oddly humanoid. Was I looking at a dinosaur? Just as I was about to reach for my camera, it abruptly turned and disappeared over a high ridge, swift as a bolt of lightning. In that moment, I realized my very primal human instinct of fight or flight, but I was frozen. In the fading light and confusion, I made a decision. I quickly retreated to my truck. I made it back to the safety of the station, but my mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, questions, and disbelief. I stayed up most of the night, fueled with coffee, flicking through biology and folklore books, and countless web pages of unverified cryptid sightings. Weeks have passed since the encounter, and I still can't explain what I saw. It terrifies me and intrigues me both at the same time. All these years I thought I knew the dunes through and through. I realize now there's a lot more hidden in this vast sandbox, a lot more secrets lurking in the shadows. The only thing I can say for certain is that if you choose to venture into the wild, remember, we are the guests there. This happened a few years ago while I was working as a park ranger at Nickerson State Park. If you've ever been, you'll know it's a pretty idyllic spot, nestled right in the curve of Cape Cod's Arm. Picture postcard stuff. We're talking lovely little kettle ponds, woods thick with pine and oak trees. Just the sort of place you'd think would be calm, serene, and safe. But boy, do I have a tale about a night that was anything but ordinary. As a park ranger, you get to love the park, like it's a part of you almost. You learn every trail, every curve, every hidden spot where the critters like to hide during the hot afternoons. Now, as you may imagine, a decent chunk of my job involved routine tasks. You check trails, mend fences, make sure tourists don't get lost, occasionally break up a rowdy party or two. I'd typically start by checking on the trails, looking for any downed trees or damage that happened overnight. I'd walk those trails so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. On that particular day, everything seemed fine during the day, not a thing out of place. As dusk settled in, I was on my usual rounds, patrolling the campgrounds, reassuring some of the campers who heard something strange in the woods. Usually it turns out to be just a raccoon or possum or some other creature. Foxes have a scream that sounds like a dying woman. People from the city don't know that, and they can get pretty spooked. I just dealt with a group of teenagers who thought it could be fun to feed the raccoons. After dispersing them, I started towards one of the more isolated loops, furthest from the park entrance. Most nights, it's the most peaceful part of the whole place, with its own little kettle pond. I personally loved it, especially at night, though I get how the isolation could put someone on edge. It was there the incident began. As I was walking, I became aware of a smell that I can only describe as putrid. It was musty like rotting wood, but also curiously acrid, almost sour. It was a thick scent that seemed to hang in the air, heavy and almost, sticky. Instantly, my gut churned. There was definitely something wrong here. I've always trusted my instincts out there in the wilderness. They've kept me safe more times than I can count. The rustling leaves, usually harmonious and comforting, began to sound threatening. A crack of a twig made me jump, though normally I would have dismissed it as a deer or a squirrel traipsing through the underbrush. The night suddenly felt extraordinarily dark, swallowing up the beam of my flashlight as I continued to tread forward, ignoring the sinking feeling in my stomach. Then I heard a noise. It began as a low, guttural grunt, resonating deep into the quiet forest around me. It came from somewhere off the path, but I couldn't find its source. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what animal out here could produce such a sound. Sound travels strangely in the woods at night. It can make the smallest animal sound like a lumbering bear if it's quiet enough. But there was something about this noise that didn't sit right with me. A shiver curved down my spine, and for the first time in my career, I felt a pang of real fear. I radioed base, but no one was answering, which was strange in and of itself, given there's always someone on hand for emergencies. I knew I was on my own in that moment. Swallowing my fear, I pushed onward, toward the weird, grating sound. Suddenly, the dense atmosphere broke with a sharp, piercing screech. It echoed with a fury I'd never heard before. It was something between a yell and a deep, resonant growl. The raw power of it reverberated through my bones. I felt then I was in danger. It was unlike anything I'd encountered in my years in the woods. There was a quick succession of knocks against a tree nearby. I stepped closer, my hand shaky on the flashlight, as I cast its beam into the haunting darkness. And that's when I saw it. 16 years in the park, and never once had I seen or heard anything like it. This creature was massive, almost 9 feet tall if I had to guess. It was hard to make out exactly in the dim lighting, but the outline was clear as day. A hulking figure, broad and muscular, stood against the backdrop of the night sky. The hard slope of a prominent forehead, heavy jaw, jutting chin, and a pair of deep-set eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. And then there was the smell. The unmistakable offensive odor I'd encountered earlier was now stronger. It was inescapable, nauseating. As for the creature itself, I could see hair, lots of it, dark brown, nearing on black. It was matted down in some places and smoother in others. A shiver of realization went down my spine when I saw its ape-like face. My mind raced, grappling with the knowledge that stories I dismissed as myths could be something more. Terrified, but hardly daring to move, I was caught between fear and fascination. But my focus was broken as my radio crackled to life. The raspy voice of my coworker filled the night. Startled, the creature huffed before it turned and disappeared into the brush with a few lengthy strides. I stood petrified with my heart beating out a terrified rhythm against my ribs. Finally, I responded to the radio, trying to calm my voice, and told them I'd be back shortly. But what could I tell them? Who'd believe me? The rest of the night was a blur, or maybe a nightmare, who knows? Making my way back, I reported no unusual incidents, logged out, and returned home. I lay in bed, the haunting image of the creature lingering in my mind. Sleep was a foreign thought. In the days that followed, I continued my rounds, half hoping and half dreading seeing the creature again. But the creature, or what some might call a Sasquatch, never made another appearance. I hoped maybe he was simply passing through, but the fear lingered. Perhaps, I thought, there were dark corners of this beautiful world, unknown and unexplored, that are home to such magnificent yet terrifying creatures. And for all others wandering the wilds, remember, there's more mystery in the world than what meets our eyes. Working as a park ranger in Wind Cave National Park is definitely not for everyone. Just ask those city slicker interns who last about as long as a snowball in the Arizona desert. But for me, I wouldn't trade it for anything. It started as a childhood love for nature and ended up being a commitment to keeping the wilderness preserved and protected. The fresh pine air, the jeweled stars on clear nights, even the challenging winter months, they all make it worthwhile to be out here. But I didn't write in to wax poetry about the joys of being a park ranger. No, I have a tale to tell, and it's quite a wild one. It all happened during a routine day at the park. For us rangers, the routine varies day by day. One day, we're out maintaining trails. The next, we are checking campgrounds or making sure our visitors aren't jumping the gorges. But that day was different. It was more of a gut feeling, you know the kind. No proof, but you just know something is off about the situation. Well, you might say my morning went by like a breeze that day. Early patrol of the trails, a light breakfast of coffee and a bagel sandwich, and a casual exchange of banter with some campers. Everything was normal and totally uneventful. By noon, I'd finished my rounds, picked up a few leftover beer cans the campers had so generously donated to the wilderness, and started heading back. There's this one trail. We call it the Ranger's Trudge because it's our own little shortcut towards the main office. It winds through the dense woods and tall trees, which provide a natural canopy, keeping the trail relatively cool even during the scorching summer. As I journeyed back, a peculiar stench filled the air. It was vile, like spoiled meat left out to bake in the sun. I have a pretty strong stomach thanks to the few grisly scenes we deal with as rangers. And boy, have I smelled some really bad roadkill during my rounds. But this smell, it was worse. Like a mixture of rancidity and decay that only something quite large and quite dead could emit. It made me gag and my eyes water. The possibility of a deceased animal near a major trail was a red flag. So acting like the responsible ranger I am, I decided to investigate. Pinching my nose, I followed the smell off trail into the denser woods. It was strange though. Wind Cave is usually teeming with the scuffles of woodland critters and bird calls, but there was this eerie silence. It was like the very woods itself was afraid to breathe. Suddenly, I heard a low sound that sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was a growl, but unlike any growl I'd heard before. I'm familiar with pretty much every noise our resident wildlife species can make, but this was different. It was less of a growl and more of a rumbling grunt. I reached for my sidearm, instantly regretting my decision to leave my rifle in the truck today. I crept silently in the direction of the sound, my heart pounding like a jackhammer, and then I saw it, a hulking, shadowy figure looming amidst the underbrush. It was big, easily 7 feet tall, covered in dark brown, almost black fur. But that's not what froze my blood. Its body, its stature, it was much like a human's. It had broad shoulders, muscular arms, but it was standing upright on hind legs reminiscent of a dog's. I felt a lump forming in my throat as my eyes moved to its face. It had a long, pronounced snout, with whiskers that twitched, seemingly picking up my scent, and a row of sharp yellow teeth glistening in the dusky light. The fur around its snout looked coarse, more gray than brown, and it leered at me with deep-set, glowing yellow eyes. It was like looking into the eyes of a predator sizing up its prey, something I had not experienced until that moment. One powerful hand or paw dug into the earth while the other was clamped around what appeared to be a deer carcass, easily explaining the putrid odor. Its snarl broke the silence again, echoing through the silent forest. It reverberated inside my chest like a second heartbeat. Needless to say, there was no effing way I was sticking around for a meet and greet with this thing. I tried to back away slowly, remembering all those survival shows that recommend not showing fear to an animal. A lot easier said than done when you're staring down what I can only describe as a hybrid werewolf. I was almost clear when I trod on a stick. The loud crack echoed like a gunshot. I prayed it didn't spook the creature, but then I heard it howl. The sound of it I'm sure will haunt my dreams until my dying day. Pressed by fear, I bolted, zigzagging among the trees, their familiar smell left tainted by that encounter's sourness. Soon I was back on the ranger's trudge, my safe, familiar trail. Strangely, as soon as I re-emerged on the trail, the forest sounds resumed, though they were now overshadowed by my pounding heart. I made it back to the main office breathing heavily, and hoping I was at least somewhat safe. The sun was setting, casting shadows across the lush woodland, and I found myself yanking all the curtains closed. As I contemplated over the evening's insanity, I couldn't help but grapple with my own fear, disbelief, and my responsibility as a park ranger. Not everyone believed my story, and I can't blame them. But I stood my ground. I rerouted the nearby trails and warned campers of aggressive bears in the area so no one else would run into this thing. The night was restless, but the break of dawn brought some relief. The creature, or the dog man as some locals came to call it, no longer haunted my every thought, but it seared in my memory. I often find myself looking over my shoulder during my patrols. Life in the wild is unpredictable, and we never really know what lurks behind the veil of wilderness.